Metro Board of Directors March 11th meetings. As this is our first April 5th, April 8th. Let me start over. Excuse me. Good morning and welcome to the Metro Board of Directors April 8th meetings. As this is our first public meeting of the day, I'll ask our Chief Safety Officer, Teresa Impastato, to begin with our safety contact.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The National Safety Council and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration designate April as Distracted Driving Awareness Month. Though traffic has dropped significantly since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, our roads have only gotten more hazardous. On a typical day, more than 700 people are still injured in distracted driving crashes. Distracted driving is any activity that diverts attention from driving. Texting is the most alarming distraction. Sending or reading a text takes your eyes off the road for 5 seconds. At 55 miles per hour, that's like driving the length of an entire football field with one's eyes closed. You can't drive safely unless the task of driving has your full attention. Take action today by committing to driving distraction-free to keep yourself and others around you safe, and just drive. For more information, visit nhtsa.gov. That concludes our safety contact.
Thank you. And again, welcome to the Metro Board today. I'm Steve McMillan, Chairman of the Finance and Capital Committee, which will be our first meeting of the morning. So I'd like to begin by asking Board Corporate Secretary Jennifer Ellison to call the roll.
Thank you. Chair McMillan.
Here.
Vice Chair Slater.
Here.
Director Smedberg.
Present.
Alternate Director Bulger.
Present.
Alternate Director Rouse.
Present.
Director Goldman.
Here.
Director Letourneau.
Here.
And Director Gideby Jenkins.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. For staff presenting today, please remember to introduce yourself by name and title. And we will now begin with a first order of business, which is approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, we'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Now we have before us the minutes of our March 11th meeting. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we will consider the minutes approved as presented. Okay, so we have several actions before the committee today, all in relation to the adoption of Metro's fiscal year 2022 budget. First up is approval of the public hearing staff report and Title VI equity analysis and adoption of the FY 2022 operating and capital budgets and the FY 2022 through 2027 capital improvement program. I'd like to acknowledge that this has been an exceptionally challenging budget process for staff, for board members, our jurisdictional partners, and in particular for our writers. We've had to go through numerous iterations of this, some of them proposing very significant changes. But thanks to a third round of federal aid, which just has been approved by Congress, Metro will be able to avoid the service and frontline staff reductions that were previously proposed for January 2022. This budget preserves existing service and provides for gradual service increases as demand continues to rebound. Just like last year's budget, as the situation on the ground evolves and as the region continues its recovery, the board will be reviewing the budget on at least a quarterly basis and making updates as needed. Next, the committee will be asked to authorize Metro to execute a 6-year capital funding agreement with our jurisdictional partners and a separate local capital funding agreement with the District of Columbia to meet specific DC requirements. The final action today for the committee will be to approve the allocation between Metro and our jurisdictional partners of funds from the Second Federal Relief Act. Staff will come back to the board at a subsequent meeting for approval of the funding allocation from the third round of federal aid enacted last month. So now we'll begin our first presentation. As a reminder, please introduce yourself, and for other participants, mute your microphones to cut down on background noise. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Wiedefeld and his team to begin today's presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Paul Wiedefeld, the General Manager. As you mentioned, it has been a extremely challenging year for us in the budgeting process, but we're very fortunate to be where we are now. So the purpose of today's meeting really is to review the new proposed 22 budget that includes the additional federal relief funding. We will also summarize the public outreach results and recommend approval of the Title VI analysis and adoption of the budget. By way of background, the fiscal year 22 proposed budget from January of 21 assumed low ridership / revenues as a result of the pandemic and did not assume additional relief funds to close an estimated $209 million operating budget gap. Since then, the American Rescue Plan funds have eliminated the budget constraints and addressed the public concerns regarding proposed service cuts that were heard through the public outreach effort that we had. The revised budget proposal for the board consideration today contains major changes from the January version. Thanks to this additional federal relief, we are proposing a revised budget that maintains existing Metro bus and Metro rail service levels, keeps stations open and does not reduce frontline employees, funds the collective bargaining agreements that we have in place, and allows us to pay per performance where it is required. Assumes that the Silver Line Phase 2 will begin revenue service in Q3 of fiscal year 22, that's January, after January, based on the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority's current expected substantial completion date by Labor Day weekend in 21, and includes the Potomac Yard Station opening in Q4 for fiscal year 22. This slide shows the details of what changed from Metro's January budget proposal. The biggest change is the restoration of previously proposed service cuts, which required $171.4 million of relief funding and changing the Silver Line Phase 2 revenue service date, which reduced the subsidy by $43.1 million. One item that is new is the $7.9 million increase in insurance premium, which is based on feedback from the Metro insurance brokers. Overall, these changes have increased the budget by $165 million, which uses the CRISA funds. Those are the funds that we received, the federal funds we received in December at roughly $15 million, and the American Recovery Funds of $193.4 million. Allocation to balance the budget, while reducing the jurisdictional subsidy by $43.4 million from the January proposal. The new budget proposal maintains the current Metro rail service levels at 80% pre-pandemic. And just to put that in perspective, our ridership is still down almost 85% throughout fiscal year, and eliminates the previously proposed Metro rail station closures and turnbacks that we would have taken in January 22 if we were not receiving the federal dollars. For Metro Bus, the new proposal retains previously approved Metro Bus service improvements scheduled to go in effect in June of 21, and provides approximately 85% of the pre-pandemic bus service levels throughout fiscal year 22. And again, we're roughly at about 40% in terms of usage of where we were in pre-pandemic. This slide highlights the improvements to the Metro bus service beginning in June 21, which will be in place throughout fiscal year 22. The improvements include extending service to 2 a.m. on 34 lines, 7 days per week, restoration of weekday peak coverage on 6 lines, restoration of full or partial all-day service on 4 lines, the restoration of Saturday service on 10 lines, and the restoration of Sunday service on 9 lines. So now I was going to have it turn to Lynn Bowersox to review the public outreach. But one thing I wanted to make very clear to the public before she goes into the detail is as difficult as this was, and I know it was on the people's minds of what they would do if these service cuts ended in January, if these service cuts kicked in January. If the board does adopt this budget, I think it's an important message to the entire community that these cuts are not coming, so they do not have to make some of the plans I'm sure that they did not want to make, assuming that those cuts were coming. So I think that's an important message we need to get out, particularly for all those that came in and participated in the public participation process. So with that, I will turn it over to Lynn Bowersox.
Thank you, Paul. This is Lynn Bowersox. I'm the Senior Vice President of Customer Service Communications and Marketing. Due to the scope and scale of the proposed service and budget changes, communications and outreach tactics were planned to ensure that customers and community members, especially those from low-income, minority, and limited English populations, receive high-quality information, communication, and feedback opportunities for the proposed budget. In addition to region-wide communications efforts, special attention was paid to soliciting feedback from customers who are still riding during the pandemic, as well as lapsed riders. And despite receiving news during the public comment period that additional federal funding was on the way, the feedback we received is vital for service planning and investment priority decision-making related to this budget and beyond. All of this input, down to the granular feedback on individual bus routes that we received, will be used to guide future pandemic recovery efforts, including where to restore service and how best to allocate federal funding. And so I just want to pause to thank all of the riders, customers, stakeholders, members of the public who did take the time to give us their feedback. The 22,400 formal responses received through one channel or another represent the highest numbers for a budget in at least a decade. 21,808 responses did come through our website. It remains the most important gateway of information for our audience. And half of the people who came through the website were using their mobile devices. So again, the increasing popularity of mobile phones for information and participation just continues to grow. 97 responses came through phones, through voice phone. And then 277 comments we received were submitted in Spanish, and that's a very high number for us. And we're glad that people feel comfortable participating in multiple languages that we offer. Overall, we are getting a much higher than average percentage of participation from minorities in this round, 24% of the responses. And that's key for us to know that we have a representative view of people in certain demographic groups, and so that the data can be interpreted properly. So this slide where, and I'm sorry, we're not synced up on the slides, but if we could stay on the budget webpage, thank you. This slide begins to tell us where the channels are, where people are coming through to give us feedback. The overview of Metro's budget situation, as well as the various service proposals under consideration, were featured. The entire webpage was translated to Spanish, including the budget overview video, which was available in 2 languages. Additionally, customer information notices were available in 9 languages all told. And in total, more than 26,000 individuals visited this website during the public comment period. This year, our hearings were conducted virtually, as you can see from one of the graphics. And it's interesting to note that we get about the same level of participation in public hearings when we conduct them virtually as what we did when we conducted them in person. This is an important lesson, perhaps, going forward. The next slide shows our in-system outreach effort. And as you can see, we conducted COVID-safe outreach in all of our stations in onboard buses and access vehicles. We reached out to 43,000 customers in languages other than English, including Amharic, Korean, Mandarin, and French. More than 37,000 brochures were handed out, 150 surveys were collected via portable tablets, and more than 1,000 people scanned the QR codes we provided for more content. As part of our push towards sustainability and real-time information, we leaned more on our digital screens this round throughout the Metrorail system for information about the budget, including our kiosk screens and our new digital passenger information screens and mezzanines and on platforms in some of our stations. On the next slide, you'll see that we continue to advertise through community media and publications. And as part of our more intensive outreach to low-income and minority populations, we used several new tactics this year, including push notifications in both English and Spanish via the Transit app, expanded direct mailings to targeted zip codes, digital radio ads in English and Spanish, and paid social media in both English and Spanish. More than 780 respondents took the budget survey because of the Transit app notifications, that link, and 1 of 4 of those were in Spanish. Of our direct mail, you see that there's 20,000 mailings that went out. 10,000 of them went towards 7 and 8, and another 10,000 were sent to 71 census tracts across the WMATA compact zone in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, with high incident rates of Title VI and ADA populations. More than 550 respondents accessed the survey via the link in the letter, and 410 respondents actually completed the survey. With respect to social media, information was placed in all of Metro's social media channels, with paid ads on Facebook reaching more than 575,000 people, and we had digital banner ads. Information appeared in apps and in mobile browsers directing people to Metro's website to learn more about the budget proposals. They generated 1.6 million total impressions, and 673,000 of those were in Spanish. These stakeholder meetings and communications, we had over 3,900 people that participated. These were largely elected officials, jurisdictional staff, community-based organizations, and community partners who received email communications from Metro. First email was sent out on February 8th, providing advance notice of the proposal and information about upcoming public comment period. And then a second email was sent with the communications toolkit when the comment period opened on February 22nd. At Director Gideby Jenkins' suggestion, we included a digital toolkit this round containing budget information that was designed to be shared with the stakeholders, constituents, and their communities. And it included messaging, maps, social media graphics, and customer information flyers in multiple languages. These were popular, and the link to the social media graphics we know was accessed more than 800 times by stakeholders. So that's a tool that we'll keep in our toolbox for future outreach. The virtual information sessions that we hosted, there were 4 of them to provide budget briefings to elected officials, jurisdictional partner staff, and leaders from business improvement districts, as well as advisory neighborhood commissions, ANCs, and the community-based organizations. They were well received as sort of train the trainer events to bring attendees up to speed on what was being proposed so that they could in turn help the people that they represent, and also to help us solicit feedback. The events were viewed by more than 100 attendees who submitted more than 30 questions and comments. And finally, just to summarize the survey feedback that we received, and I should say clearly that when reviewing the results of this survey, it's important to remember that the context for the responses was very much about Metro facing a severe fiscal cliff in 22. And so on this chart, for example, predictably, the tolerance level for service reductions was higher than the tolerance for fewer service hours, for example, or station closures. So it's all relative. Recognizing that the fiscal cliff would not be an issue in this calendar year, 2021, nearly 7 in 10 customers support increases in service before the end of the year to meet expected demand as the region recovers from the pandemic. I will now turn this over to Dennis Sanosike for the proposed operating budget.
Thank you, Lynn. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Dennis Sanosike, CFO for Metro. The next few slides will provide additional details on Metro's proposed operating budget. Slide 16 shows projected revenues for fiscal year 2022, which includes federal funds compared to fiscal year 2021 and the 2 prior fiscal years. The proposed FY 2022 budget assumes that ridership will rebound slowly from FY 2021, with greater ridership recovery on Metro Bus than on Metro Rail. As a result, the proposed budget before the committee this morning projects fiscal year 2022 revenue at $223 million, which is $57 million higher than fiscal year 2021 amended budget, just almost $550 million below pre-pandemic levels. To balance the budget, the proposal allocates $723 million of federal relief funds to replace lost revenue, lower local subsidy, and additional cost increases compared to the January budget proposal. Slide 17 shows operating expenses for fiscal year 2022, which is higher than fiscal year 2021 due to the restoration of paratransit services, Silver Line Phase 2 and related equity investments, as well as the insurance and cleaning supplies that the general manager mentioned earlier in his presentation. On slide 18, we show aggregate revenues, expenses, subsidy, and relief funding for fiscal year 2022 compared to the January docket, as well as the FY 2021 amended budget. But revenues and expenses have increased from the elimination of previously proposed service reductions. Subsidy also went down from the docket by $43.4 million due to the delay related to Silver Line, as well as the transfer of Route 3A. Federal relief fund, as you can see on this slide, is increased by $208 million to $723 million in order to balance the budget. On the next slide, we show subsidy proposed for fiscal year 2022, including the $1.1 billion of base subsidy in column 2 and legislative excluded contributions in columns 4 and 5. A key change from the docket is the $36.4 million previously needed for Silver Line Phase 2 has been removed. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Tom Webster, to discuss the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Dennis. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Tom Webster. I'm the Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management at Metro. Following the public participation process and the public hearing and the revision in the proposed operating budget plan, staff conducted the required Title VI equity analysis of that new proposed plan. And essentially, that analysis asks two fundamental questions. Is there a disparate impact on minority populations? And is there a disproportionate burden on low-income populations? That analysis found no disparate impact and no disproportionate burden in the revised proposed plan. And just as a reminder, that analysis is comparing back to pre-pandemic service levels and demographic information. This analysis did not include the Silver Line Phase 2 operation, as that will be conducted separately within 6 months of the start of revenue service of that new extension. And of course, there's additional detail and analysis in a memorandum that's attached to the resolution. Now move to the capital program. So Metro's capital program, proposed capital program, continues to focus investment in safety, reliability, and the state of good repair of the rail, bus, and paratransit systems. The proposed FY 22 to 27 6-year CIP totals $12.3 billion, and the proposed FY 22 capital budget totals $2.6 billion. And that $2.6 billion reflects an acceleration of critical structures, systems, and facilities projects during or to catch up on significantly overdue infrastructure work. Metro's investing that $12.3 billion and $2.6 billion across 6 investment categories, including railcar facilities, rail systems, track and structures, stations, bus facilities and paratransit, and business and operations support investments. Importantly, the proposed budget before the committee today is unchanged from the proposal presented to the committee this winter and presented to the public for the public hearing process. This chart also depicts the revenue loss expected from capital projects and reflects a new estimate of out-year debt service requirements that will be supported by dedicated funding. Like the overall capital program, the FY22 financial plan for the FY22 capital budget remains largely unchanged. We have slightly updated our expected federal formula grant estimates, very minor adjustment there. And we have updated the allocation of jurisdictional allocated contributions to reflect the most recent and up-to-date operating subsidy allocations. Looking ahead to FY22 and beyond, of course, we face some risks and considerations and some opportunities, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, uncertainty from a funding and financial and economic standpoint, but also potential opportunities for investment and improvement in the system. Of course, we continue to have emerging capital maintenance and safety needs. Our capital program, we face also some external challenges in terms of permitting and third-party approvals. We are looking forward to the opening of the Silver Line Phase 2 and examining service levels as the region recovers from the pandemic. With that, staff recommends the committee's acceptance of the staff report summarizing public participation, approval of the Title VI equity analysis, and approval of the FY22 operating budget and capital budget, as well as the 6-year capital program. That concludes the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. So we'll move next to questions and comments, starting with members of the committee. But first, I would like to move approval of the staff recommendation. Could I get a second?
Second, Mr. Chair.
Got that, Jennifer?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And as a reminder, when we get to the vote, all board members, not just committee members, can vote on this item. So I'll start the discussion. Could we turn to slide 6, please? So I want to use this to briefly discuss the ramp up of service, this being the starting point for whatever service levels we wind up with once we've gotten to a new stable point. So one factor here is that as the GM mentioned when this slide was presented, supply is leading demand, at least in raw system-wide percentage terms. I believe you said that on the rail side, we're at roughly 15% of pre-COVID ridership, but running 80% of the service frequency, and then something like 40% and 85% on bus. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, this is Paul Wheatfield. Yes, sir.
Thanks. And so that measurement, and I think this question's maybe more relevant on the bus side than the rail side. The 80 and 85%, I'm assuming represents number of vehicles over a period of time, correct? And on the bus side, the actual capacity of each vehicle, because of distancing requirements, is not what it was pre-COVID. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes.
Okay. So on the bus side in particular, when you get to specific routes and specific times of day, even though overall we're at 85% of pre-COVID service, there are some places and times of day where demand is actually much closer to supply.
Yes, it could, yes, with literally thousands of bus stops and people getting on and off, yes, for
Right.
sure.
So I imagine just in terms of, scheduling and planning and all that, figuring out not just how to have supply lead demand on an aggregate basis, but down to that level. Is this something we have a handle on, or we're still doing, or are we still kind of experimenting and having a reserve to figure out how to make sure that supply continues to lead demand as people start coming back?
Yes, 2 points I'd like to make. One is on the bus, it's not an 85% straight across the board. It's literally looking at where the demand is and then applying, the resources to that. And then we literally are monitoring what's happening on the lines. So if we see, a particular line or a particular segment line, we try to put more service there. So that's giving us some flexibility to do that.
Okay. And on the other factor for restoration of service is at what point, from a safety standpoint, we can start to tolerate more crowding. And I wonder if Teresa could maybe comment. I don't know if there's a bright line that's been developed at this point, but could you at least perhaps discuss some of the factors that would allow us to start moving back towards tolerating a pre-COVID level of crowding on buses and on rail cars?
Certainly. So we've been working with CDC and APTA to continue to monitor the guidance available. There is no current set established standard, but it will be related to the establishment of herd immunity. Larger percentages of vaccinated populations will be necessary before we'll be able to really have the capacity to allow folks to not require the 6-foot social distancing. We'll continue to monitor that as well. And once there are standard threshold targets, we will absolutely adhere to them.
Okay. And what I'm trying to get at here is that there's 2 paths to increasing the supply for our passengers. One is vehicles, and one is how much we can pack those vehicles, which of course will be determined by safety. And I would guess even as distancing requirements perhaps are eased, some of the other things, including masking and cleaning and things like that, will continue for some time.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So that's an area we'll have to be constantly looking at as we look at reviewing this budget quarterly going forward. Next, just a couple of things for Lynn on the public outreach side. And Lynn, you covered your side of this in pretty good detail. So I just am hoping for kind of simple answers here. The way public outreach is being conducted today is obviously very different from pre-COVID. You've described many of the specific ways that it's different. Would you characterize this as augmentation, reinvention, somewhere in between on that scale? How different is this from the way your job used to be done?
So I think it's both. We have supplemented many of the tactics that we used to use in order to reach more people. And certainly we are reinventing using technology, some of the ways in which we get access to customer feedback.
So I would suspect many of the new tactics you're using are likely to be persistent as opposed to stopgap things just because of COVID.
That's right. And I think there's some lessons learned here about how to reach more difficult to reach folks, and we want to take those into future public participation outreach initiatives, not just budget related, but related to capital projects and other things.
And then I think you referenced this briefly as well. In addition to the sort of broad results data that you presented today, these detailed surveys produced quite a bit of more granular data that you've got available to yourself, and I'd like you to confirm that everything we gathered as a part of this process that involved all these people coming forward. Today's not the expiration date on the utility of that with today's action. This is data that will continue to be utilized by you and the rest of the management team and in future recommendations to the board.
That's exactly right. And Mr. Chairman, the service planning folks, the research team, we all get together and use this information and do data deep dives in order to understand where the puts and takes should be in service. And so we really do, we're very genuine in our appreciation for our customers taking the time to give us this, because it gives us a roadmap for service increases and improvements as we move through the recovery.
Okay. Thanks. With that, can we switch to slide 22, please? And Mr. Webster, just I know this is something that's been done publicly in the past, but I often feel compelled to repeat it. So looking at the last 4 years of the 10-year capital plan, the 2.4 billion a year bars, just want to reemphasize, and if you would confirm as well, that those figures, unlike the figures for the first 6 years of the CIP, are not constrained by known identified available funding sources, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And so to execute on that portion of the plan, once we get to there, will require the board, the region, to identify the full amount of funding required, some portion of which is not currently identified, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so just something that is not a today emergency, urgent thing. We know how we're going to execute the first 6 years of this program, but looking beyond that, that is a conversation the region is going to have. So that's it for me, and let me turn next to Secretary Slater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick questions. Maybe let me start with Lynn on slide 19 again. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I'm in the wrong slide. Sorry. I think the last one there. Keep going back. Well, let me just kind of, without the slide, let me just kind of jump question with Lynn. I feel like we got a lot of really, really great kind of public feedback on this one with a lot of participation. I'd like to understand a little bit if we've done anything differently this time to engage, or whether just people were more engaged in general, just trying to understand that a little bit.
Sure. No, I think that it's a combination. So when you're talking about really severe changes to service, you get the public's attention and participation. But we did actually use new tactics this time, whether it was through the digital space, opportunities to engage through getting a mail sent to your house, by allowing you to engage with a survey in a different language that might be more comfortable for you. There were a lot of different tactics and channels, and we used technology in a new way that I think helped contribute to the level of participation that we saw.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I just thought it was great to point that out because I know, I find that sometimes you just have to meet people where they are, and maybe that's in a
Absolutely.
digital space right now. Just a couple of questions for Tom. With acceleration, related back to, probably go to slide 22. I'm going to follow a little bit of the same line as the chairman did. So just acceleration of some of the capital investments over the next couple of years because of revenue and interest rates and ridership being down. When we calculate revenue loss based on the capital improvements, did we calculate that in a different way based on ridership? And did we calculate it in a way where if we had to delay some of this, how much more revenue we would have lost if we would try to do that at a later time when service was, when the demand was much higher?
To the first question, Mr. Secretary, the projections of revenue loss are just that, they're projections. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, the calculation will be based on actual ridership, not based on those projections. And we certainly can look into a financial analysis of what those revenue loss implications would be if we were to be less aggressive in getting after some of the overdue capital needs.
Right. Yeah, I just think it's an important part of the story, because when I look at the comments and kind of the projections in 26 and 27, where less money available to do capital because of increased debt service and other things that we're advancing here, it's important to note that in a different scenario, we may be actually doing capital work that was envisioned for 25, 26, and 27 in 22 and 23. And so I just kind of want to get some validation on that my thinking is correct on that.
Okay, we will look into that. I believe you are correct, but we can follow up with a little bit more detailed analysis.
Great, thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bowersox, I want to go back to it's your slide 24, responses to proposed changes to the for January 22, that one right there. Mm-hmm. Could you give us just a little more insight, if there is any to provide, other than the numbers that are presented here today, with the yellow line and the red line turnbacks? How did people view that? Give us, is there any background to those numbers that you could give us, the comments that came in?
So in my presentation, Mr. Chairman, I talked about how this is a relative chart, and it's relative to the context of, I would call this the lesser of evils. That's really the way to see it, right? Okay. So, I'm more supportive of less frequent service. The turnbacks are another form of less frequent service, and then no service after 9 and closing my station are the things that I'm least supportive of. So that's how to interpret the turnbacks, is that it's that people are more tolerant of that than alternatives that they view as more draconian.
Okay, because we have had discussion on it, and there are differing views, as you know, on the board about this. So that sort of popped out at me. And the same could be said for the 30-minute headways, I guess, as well.
Exactly. And so, if you gave people choices that were, 2 to 3 minutes, 8 to 12 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, you would get a predictable response. But in this instance, it was, if we face this fiscal cliff, could you, continue to use the service and tolerate for some period of time a 30-minute headway? And so, again, the alternative is sort of a no service option. And so people said here that they would continue to ride under those circumstances.
Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Webster, one last question. The chair and secretary had a few that I was going to ask, or one I was going to ask. Mr. Webster, about the capital side of things and the concern about looking years out, what is our, do we, I know I think we reaffirm our debt policy, or you have proposed the affirmation of our debt policy. And could you just articulate that for us so we're all on the same page with that, please? The debt management.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, if Dennis is available, I think that's a question best.
Oh, okay. Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
The debt policy that we are seeking affirmation of is to comply with the Maryland legislation that requires that annual review. But in this case, what we're saying is that the debt policy approved by the board last year is consistent at the present time with the goal that the board has set, which is to support the capital program focused on the use of long-term debt to support long-term capital projects, and the dedicated revenues dedicated exclusively to capital, with the timeline, long-term assets or bonds limited to 30 years, that we come to the board both in the approval as well in the initial approval and the subsequent approval of the debt. It allows WMATA to be as both diligent in terms of the use of debt and flexible in terms of either competitive or negotiated transactions. There's no fundamental change to the policy that the board approved last year at this time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. And I would note that, Dennis, if you could confirm this characterization, the policy that we have adopted is qualitative, not quantitative. So it covers the way in which we issue debt in order to achieve lowest cost of capital. But there is not guidance in that policy as it stands regarding the amount, the timing, et cetera. That's something that's handled with each debt issuance, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Next, Mr. Bolger.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my favorite topics, I forget what slide it's on, but it's the congestion mitigation and air quality funding that I believe was towards the end of the slide deck. And it showed up for a contribution from, I think, Virginia of 1 million plus. It's on the right-hand side under the Virginia funding. Just curious, since I worked on getting the congestion mitigation air quality funding set up like 20 years ago with a bunch of my colleagues, how come there's no CMAQ funding from Maryland and DC?
So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, and Mr. Bolger, as you know, the CMAQ funds are received directly by the jurisdictions. In Virginia's case, they do flex a small amount of their allocation to WMATA to buy buses each fiscal year. In the past, other jurisdictions have done similar, but at this time, only Virginia is doing that small flex of some of their CMAQ allocation.
Okay, seems like a pauper, such a minor contribution, which it could be larger. Maybe the Secretary of Maryland could tell us why Maryland doesn't flex CMAQ money.
We use our dedicated funding stream for our WMATA funding, and we flex our CMAQ money for transit purchases on our Baltimore system.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next, Mr. Rouse.
Yeah, I think just two quick points here. First, special thank you to everybody who commented. I think 22,000 plus comments is quite tremendous and very helpful, especially when you're trying to make decisions like the ones we might potentially continue to face or were facing a couple months ago. But for all the public input and everybody who took the time to comment, special thank you, and everybody who was involved in the public comment process and collecting those comments. The only other thing I want to say is just to reinforce a point from the secretary, in that when we look at the long-range capital funding, you do need to consider the total cost. And I do think that's important when you're talking, especially infrastructure. It doesn't help to be short-sighted. So knowing what the implications are to putting off work and what the cost impacts would be for having to do that work later on is important in the equation and getting the full information to make decisions. So I do think any additional insight into that as we move along with some of these decisions and discussions with the capital planning will be helpful. So I just want to reinforce that point as well. That's all I've got.
All right, thank you. Next is Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that the budget that we have before us today, the operating budget, is a much better one than the one that was on the docket and the one that I had to preside over for a Maryland public hearing on the budget during the winter. I guess that was in February. And so now that we have assured riders with this budget, that service will be there through all of FY 2022 with no station closures, no layoffs, no doomsday budget, with giving thanks to the Biden administration and the Congress for the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which provided $30.5 billion nationally for transit, including at WMATA. So now I think we need to give our riders some incentives to return to the system, and specifically Metro Rail in the fall. And therefore, I don't think our work on the FY 22 budget is totally done for this year. And so I would ask the Finance Committee to consider some initiatives in the FY 22 operating budget to boost Metro Rail ridership starting after Labor Day, when some back to work efforts by businesses should be underway. We cannot continue to operate a rail system at 15% of pre-COVID ridership levels, as stated by the general manager in his opening presentation, and nor can we even be satisfied with a system that's at 34% of projected pre-COVID levels by June 2022, which is the basis for the ridership and revenue projections in this FY 22 budget. I think we need to get riders back on the rails and not staying home, not driving to work, because that is an option come fall when people go back to work, nor riding on the bus, however much we might want to improve service on Metrobus. I say that because historically it has been Metro Rail ridership and Metro Rail ridership revenues that have been the basis for the financing of the whole Metro Rail system, where we provided, or relied, I should say, for Metro Rail for about 80% of our passenger revenues on a pre-COVID basis. So specifically, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask your Finance Committee to consider 3 steps to incentivize rail riderships in the fall. First, going to a standard all-day rail fare, one rail fare, no more peak fares. At 15% pre-COVID ridership levels, we really don't have any peaks. And I think going to a single so-called off-peak schedule without peak fares will give riders a big boost by reducing maximum fares from $6 down to $3.85 and reducing the base fare from $2.25 to $2. That should be a big incentive to riders generally, and it also should be a big help to our essential riders who have been forced, if they travel at peak periods, to be paying for these higher rail fares to get to their essential service jobs in our grocery stores, hospitals, bus drivers, or wherever they were. Second of all, I would suggest on a trial basis, a simplified zone system to encourage ridership return at $2 for trips within DC, $3 for trips within the Beltway, and a max of $3.85 for all other trips, like trips on Silver Line, beyond Tyson's Corner, or outbound on the Red Line, beyond to Grosvenor, all the way out to Shady Grove. And I would suggest third, free or steeply reduced daily parking rates at all of our metro lots and garages. I think we need to provide some incentives, especially for the long distance commuters who are going to be difficult to bring back to rail. The experience that other systems, such as the Long Island Railroad and Metro North in New York, show that those lines have taken the biggest hit in terms of ridership. And I suspect our long distance riders on the orange line, the yellow line, the silver line, and the red line are also down in very significant numbers. I would suggest that the incentives that I propose in items 2 and 2, the simplified fare structure and the free or reduced rate parking at our garage, would be on a pilot basis and would last from Labor Day 2021 till the end of November, after the Thanksgiving holiday. It's a pilot, it's an experiment. We can see if it works. We can see if it generates more traffic. Now, I think this is something that we can certainly afford. And in fact, it's something we almost have to do. I would reference slide 16, if you can show that, which Mr. Anoseki referred to on revenue, which shows that we are projecting only 169 million in fare revenue, including bus, for all of FY22 versus the 666 million, which was our fare revenue pre-COVID. And we now have the opportunity with the new federal COVID funds to try and stimulate rail ridership to get us moving back in the direction of that 666 million. I don't know that we'll ever get back to our pre-COVID levels, but even if we only get back to 80 or 85%, let alone 90%, it'll be a big improvement in the finances of this authority, as well as greater use of our principal asset in this region, which is Metro Rail. I think the revenue loss, if there is any revenue loss at all, is minimum. Even if it were $50 million, which is highly unlikely, it seems to me it's worth the effort. With our new FY22 budget is now using only 208 million of the approximately 1 billion of new federal funds that WMATA secures in the latest COVID relief bill, this third round tranche of funding, which was approved by Congress last month. With that kind of money at our disposal, I think we have the resources now for such a fair incentive program to give a boost to Metro Rail riders and help them return to the system. Now, Mr. Chairman, this doesn't have to be a job done today. I think we could get some options from staff over the next couple months so that we can act by our June board meeting, so we have something in place to implement by Labor Day in terms of a rider incentive program on the fare side. So I would end by just asking the general manager whether it be possible to provide the committee and the board with some options for fare reductions to stimulate greater ridership over the next 30 days, so that the Finance Committee and the board can consider such a program of incentives over the next 2 months. So we're in shape to debut it for our ridership for our riders by Labor Day in the fall. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wiedefeld, if you could respond to the last question from Mr. Goldman real quick.
Sure. From a technical perspective, yes, we could repair it. I think it's obviously a policy decision for the board if they, choose to go that way. But from a technical point, yes, we could produce it.
Thanks. And Mr. Goldman, just as chairman of the committee, I agree that fair policy is a piece that we should consider in the context of growing the ridership again and building service back. Quick question to Mr. Wiedefeld or to the relevant staff. I'm guessing that our old models for the price sensitivity of demand are not nearly as informative as they used to be.
Correct.
Okay, so in a sense, some of the analysis you'll be able to provide may require a little more faith than in previous years.
Yes, I mean,
In
we'll
terms of
have to make
revenue
some,
effect and the demand effect.
yes, we'll have to make some assumptions, but yes, it can't be based on the old model. To be frank, given that, but I think in terms of just giving some parameters, I think we can do that.
Okay. Thanks for
Mr.
that.
Chairman, can I just make one more comment and
Yes,
just a
yeah,
response?
go
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think our elasticity models or anything else out there is going to be of any value. I sort of see this as similar to the position that the Roosevelt administration was in during the Depression in the 30s. And for us, this is sort of the same thing. Where at that point it was unemployment rates in 20, 25, 30%. For us, it's having a loss of ridership in the range of 85% on Metro Rail. And so I think what's called for is what was called for back then in the New Deal, some bold, persistent experimentation. Let's try to do some things. We're not going to know whether they're going to work, but I think we need to try to do some things on an experimental pilot basis to try and resuscitate demand, especially on the rail side. And so, doing things, it may not be exactly what I've suggested. Maybe there's some other ideas that staff will have, but I think we need to come up with some incentives on the price side, on the rail side, in order to encourage our historic riders to come back to the Metro Rail system. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for those comments, Mr. Goldman. Next is Mr. Letourneau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this has been quite a ride in terms of a process. We're sort of on our third different budget, really. No fault of anybody, but just the situation that we've been in with the uncertainty on COVID and the federal actions that have taken place. I am extremely grateful that we do have that federal funding to allow us to avoid the type of cuts that we were contemplating, which would have been very destructive to our riders and to our system. There has been some attention on the Silver Line, and so I will just reiterate that the actions that the Metro Board is taking is simply to be consistent with the current construction timeline, including the announcement by the Airports Authority of substantial completion around Labor Day. Just by sort of running the clock on that, it puts us into 2022 in terms of operational status for phase 2. There is a great deal of interest in Northern Virginia, of course, on that. But the Metro Board is just reflecting that reality with this budget, rather than making a new announcement or pronouncement here with this action. Regarding fare policy, I think what Mr. Goldman put forward in terms of some ideas has a lot of merit. And I think in particular, it's been no secret that I've been interested in all sorts of fare ideas, such as family passes and I think the peak versus non-peak scenario doesn't make a lot of sense. I also think we're going to know more in the next couple months about what Workforce is doing We're starting to see some announcements in the region about when folks are heading back to work. I think, Labor Day is kind of the time that schools hopefully will be back in school. And it sounds like some employers will be bringing people back to work. We haven't seen anything from the federal government. The more intelligence we have on all that, the better. So, I think our best course of action would be to move forward with this budget right now, given that we have a lot of folks waiting for these numbers, jurisdictions and so forth, and then to really have a good, fair policy discussion as a board, which I think, can start as soon as next week for us. But then continue and solicit ideas from jurisdictional staff. I know that, in Virginia, we've had many of these conversations over the last couple of years through our MBTC Metro Committee, and we have kind of a ready-made list of things that we're interested in pursuing. We would need significant staff analysis, obviously, on those. But I think there's a menu of options for us to look at here to help bring back riders. And it's important to focus on those rail riders to drive revenue, and also, as Mr. Goldman said, to ensure that we don't end up back in the days of Washington traffic, which we're all very familiar with. So I think that is something we can pivot to here in the next few months and start making some decisions about how to utilize the additional federal funding. I will say that I don't want us to do too much that's revenue negative, simply because I believe we will need this funding for fiscal year 23 as well. And we'll need to make sure that we have enough left to plug the holes that will likely still exist. Hopefully they won't be as deep as they would have been this year. But it's hard to believe that we would receive another huge tranche of money after getting this much. And so we have to be mindful of what FY23 is going to look like, and what our needs are going to be to ensure we can at least maintain this type of 80% plus service that we're talking about. And then lastly, on the capital side, I think we need to really begin the regional conversation this year about dedicated funding and the fact that we're going to run out of it in a number of years. I do think that there is some refinement we can do to our debt policy to improve sort of how we're using debt and understand better on a multi-year basis how debt's being applied to certain projects. And that will really allow the region to see what the impacts are. The projects that we're doing in our capital program are largely a big chunk of it is state of good repair. And I've said this before, but I think it's very easy for us to be out of sight, out of mind with those type of things, but they are safety. They are essential. And so they're things that we have to get done, and they're not going to stop in 27 and 28 when we start running out of capital and debt ability to do that. So long term, that's a major concern of mine. Thank you very much to all the staff and to all the members of the public that participated in the process.
Thank you. And Ms. Gideby Jenkins.
Thank you. I want to start with echoing my appreciation to the staff in terms of just being able to provide this revised budget, but also all the work that has gone in. More specifically, I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on the public engagement process. So you can just maybe bring me to slide 9. Lynn, I want to thank you. I know there was great brainstorming as to how we would just engage the riders and region overall in terms of public input. And I think the reflection of the comments and the numbers that we've gotten to date kind of speaks to many of those efforts, only because I believe that it's important that we hear from those who we're hoping to help. I want to kind of dig in a little bit deeper into some of the numbers and just understand more so for the future how we continue to ensure that we engage riders appropriately to get the right balance of information. One of the things that I thought was interesting in reading the numbers is that of the 22,000 responses that we received, 3,700 came from Metro bus riders, active for that matter. And so that's about 16%. And for me, I'm just wondering what you're seeing or why you think the numbers, when you put it more into the percentage of folks who are riding Metro bus, knowing that that's the largest percentage using the system right now, why the comments don't really correspond in the same way in terms of what we got overall. So when we look at who actually is using the system right now, we got about 53%, which I think is good generally. So about more than half of the people who are using Metro in this moment during the pandemic. But for Metro Bus, it kind of, the numbers raised some concerns for me. So I just wanted to hear from you why you think the delta's here. How does it compare maybe to the past when you think about that in terms of Metro Bus more specifically? And then what you think we might be able to do? Is it more folks at the bus stops versus maybe street teams at the rail so that we can get a better sense of how, particularly because this is the group of folks who are using the system the most at this time, how we can get a better sampling?
Right, so I think that this is a large sample for us. Compared to historically, we do mostly get that current active bus customer through in-person outreach on board buses at transit stops, and bus and rail riders as they move through the transfers and connections as well. You know, I think that through the workshops that we did with community-based organizations and some of the elected officials in the jurisdictions, you know, reaching out through more of the service providers in the community would also be helpful in terms of engaging bus customers who may be taking advantage of other jurisdictionally provided services. I don't think that we've exploited that channel enough. And so partnerships through the jurisdictions would help us in that regard. Largely, you know, the mystery around bus versus rail rider participation has been persistent for a long time. And, you know, when you look at the population of riders on rail, we do have a high percentage of minority riders on rail as well. And so it's not clear whether it's strictly about income or if it's something else that is a barrier. But I think that one of the things that we should start asking is in these surveys and in the outreach that we conduct, what would make it easier for you?
Okay, yeah.
Versus just throwing darts at the wall and trying different things. You know, going to where people are clearly is what they've told us is what they need. And so when we do that, we get higher participation, but exploring where those other points of intersection are is important. They've told us, the bus customers have told us that the most important thing we can do is come to them when they are riding and ask their opinion. And so that's how we get these results. But to get beyond that, we need more input back from folks to talk about other opportunities.
Okay, that's helpful. The other piece that came up for me is that we only got about 6% of low-income riders that make less than $30,000 a year. And about 10% of the survey response identified as Black overall. So I was just, it doesn't reflect WMATA's current ridership. As part of it, this was in the material package. I don't think that there was a slide on that. And so how are we trying to improve? What do you think is showing up, especially for the low income? Because I feel like for that piece, 6%, when that is the majority of the folks who are using the system right now, also speaks to a large gap that we probably missed. And again, this is not a critique on the process, because I think this is above, we really did brainstorm, but I think the results for me, I think what you gave us is kind of what you guys did, which I think is great. And I think it really reflects kind of a new day at Metro, but what we got back still shows a large gap. So especially understanding who's using Metro right now, that 6% of low-income riders doesn't add up for me. So I just wanted to know, again, like, what do you think? What are you thinking in terms of the income question in this survey process?
So, you know, we've taken away most of the barriers to participation for low-income people by providing, you know, mail routes, phone routes, digital routes that are accessible by their mobile phones, which we know from Pew research that folks have even in the lowest income households. So we know that the channels are pretty barrier free. I think the one remaining barrier we were concerned about was foreign language. I think in this instance, we did take a giant step forward in terms of providing non-English opportunities for people who are more comfortable in another language, perhaps as a first language. And so I think that, we did show some progress. We moved the needle on that. And I think in many instances, and there is overlap here, that in some of those communities, we also captured some low income folks. So I think we just have to keep removing the barriers. But at the same time, I think we need to get a message to those communities that their input is welcome and needed. I think that perhaps there's a legacy issue here around, feeling that this is going to matter. And that's going to take time to really build that level of trust and two-way dialogue with that part of our customer base, I think.
Okay. And then my final piece was on the Spanish response. So more specifically, I think that's slide 11, just 2 more slides over. Okay. So it was clear, right? Like that the street teams were effective. It seemed like we stayed at the Bay. So I do wonder if we could go to kind of some of the higher stops that we know have a lot of folks coming on in the future as part of it. Again, just thinking for the future forward. But if 1 in 5 were speaking or spoke Spanish, when I looked at the actual survey numbers, it said about the people who completed the survey was about 1.2%. So I'm like, how did we go from 1 in 5 who spoke Spanish to the completion of us getting their survey to being under 2% as part of those pieces?
So two things. Not everybody that we interact with completed the survey, number one. And number two, some people we interact with feel comfortable in conversational Spanish, but when they go on to take the survey, they will actually take it in English. And so they may feel more comfortable conversationally, but they may feel comfortable reading English and checking the box.
Okay.
So both of those are true.
Okay. Overall, thank you for all the work that you did. I'm very grateful. I think I'm just really trying to, for me, process is one thing, outcome is another. So really figuring out how do we get to the space where we're getting the most from those who are using the system right now to help us to make the best decision. And I think what we know is that folks are using Metro Bus. We know that those who are most dependent at this point are low income. And we also know that those who are speaking alternative languages also need that level of support. So to see what our outcomes were, I'd like us to continue to just refine the process so that we can get to them in the best ways possible. But I appreciate your leadership on this. I really appreciate the ways in which you are open to new ideas for us to push ourselves. And I hope that we continue to do more. And then I just want to speak to Mr. Goldman's piece. I think actually I kind of stand with some of the pieces that were raised in us trying to push ourselves on the fair policies. I also just hope that, one of the big achievements from FY21 before COVID happened was us really thinking about how we offer greater equity and no longer penalize folks in terms of the transfers. And we did approve that as a board, and then we had to hold it because of what was happening with COVID. I do hope that we can bring that conversation back. I don't want that to be lost. It was something that the board had agreed to do, and we had to suspend it to ensure that we could ensure that safety came first as a priority. As a result, we were able to offer, free access, more so for the safety of our employees, but also to ensure that we could get folks to where they needed to go to. When we restored payment for Metro Bus, I was hoping that we would also ensure that I am hoping that we can consider how we restore the policy that we put forward and the transfer fee discount as part of those conversations. But I do think that there is an overall fair policy discussion that does need to happen. And I'm not sure that we'll be able to get there in 2 weeks. I think there's more that we might need to do as part of it, but I'm open to many of the proposals that have been shared. And I am excited about where we're going and really imagining how the system continues to work for all of us into the future. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Mr. Bolger, I see your hands up. Do you have another question?
Yeah, let me get unmuted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to return to what Mr. Goldman was talking about in terms of after Labor Day. I think we should actively entertain input from the Washington Board of Trade, the downtown bids concerning what they're hearing, what they're learning, what they're polling about employees returning to their workplace after Labor Day as a starting point. I think that would be very helpful. Secondly, based on Michael's proposal about parking, could we find out what the parking inventory currently looks like as a baseline on our parking structures, so we know where we're starting from in terms of usage as of today going forward? I don't know, Michael, if you think that's reasonable.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can't see you and I can't raise my hand, but just respond to Mr. Bolger. You know, I would assume, Tom, that if we're only operating and carrying 15% of pre-COVID levels on rail, that, you know, we're not parking a lot of people in our lots and garages. But I agree with you. It's worth having that number available so we can just see what the starting point is in terms of you know, risk of parking revenue loss. I suspect it's kind of minimal, and it would be minimal over the 3 months of the pilot that I would be proposing.
Yeah, I just think, Michael, it'd be a baseline for which we can compare fair policy activities going forward.
Yeah, it'll certainly be a baseline for us to know after 3 months, if something like this goes forward, how useful that kind of incentive has been in trying to attract people back to rail.
Okay, all right, so will the staff be able to get us as many baselines going forward as is appropriate? Paul?
Yes, Tom, this is Paul Wiedefeld, General Manager. Yes, definitely. We have that data now. It's something obviously we want to monitor, but literally we'll have to create a series of baselines for anything that we would look at. So yes, we will have that. And we have it.
Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And then Mr. Rouse, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, I won't belabor this much longer, but I did want to throw my hat in the ring for support for looking at, you know, some fair policy issues or really anything, because 15% certainly isn't sustainable. And we need to do whatever we can to try to drive ridership back. And if any revenue aspect of looking at revenue is always good for any healthy system. So one thing I did want to touch on, though, in terms of if we do something or explore this, you know, even just basic inflection point data would be useful, but also consider what marketing and advertising needs would be, because all too often people try to induce ridership and create these programs, but don't advertise it. And so if you're trying to get people that aren't already on the system, if they don't know about what you're doing, you just end up, you know, it just ends up in the red because you're not actually driving any people to the system. So that would be important. You're going to have to do more than we're doing today, you know, TV ads, radio ads, something of that nature to let people know. But that would be important to include in any assessment or information on the policy or planning for that policy. So just wanted to throw that out there.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rouse. And with that, I'll close discussion on this item and ask the board corporate secretary to administer a roll call vote.
Thank you. Chair McMillan.
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater.
Aye.
Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Bolger.
Aye.
Mr. Rouse.
Aye.
Mr. Goldman.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
And Ms. Gideby Jenkins.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you. And we took quite a bit of time as appropriate on that first agenda item. I think we can move through the next two much more quickly. So Mr. Webster, if you would proceed with the capital funding agreement presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Give me 1 second to bring the PowerPoint slides up.
Great.
So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, we recommend committee approval of a new capital funding agreement among Metro and the jurisdictions, as well as a local capital funding agreement between Metro and the District of Columbia. Our existing agreements expire at the end of this fiscal year, FY21, and Metro and the jurisdictions have been working towards a new consensus long-term 6-year agreement or 6-year agreements for some time now. Just for background, the CFA governs the allocated contributions from the jurisdictions, the funding provided to match FTA, Federal Transit Administration grants, as well as system performance funds. It does not include PREA or dedicated funding. It confirms our expenditure-based management of the capital program, establishes the schedule, reporting, and audit requirements. And this new agreement will confirm the 3% annual allocated contribution growth cap for FY22 and for the next 6 years. And as I mentioned, there is a parallel agreement between Metro and the District of Columbia that addresses some specific requirements applicable only to the district. I'd just like to take a moment to thank those involved in the development of these new long-term agreements from the jurisdictions and from the Metro team. A lot of work has gone into this, both in developing the documents and then working towards reaching a consensus on the terms. So with that, staff recommends approval of the resolution authorizing the execution of the new 6-year CFA and the District of Columbia local funding agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we begin discussion, I'd like to move approval of this item, and could I get a second?
Second.
Sounded like Mr. Bulger. Again, I'm hoping discussion on this item can be brief. I have no comments other than to say that after multiple years of 1-year extensions, it'd be nice to complete this process, and I'm sure you'll be as happy or happier than any of us for that to happen, Mr. Webster. Mr. Slater, Secretary Slater, excuse me.
No questions from me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg.
Mr. Chair, I'll add my name to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bulger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I applaud the fact that we are able to get the closure on a CFA. I wanted to ask Tom about the joint regional audit goal that we established years ago. And it's my understanding that WMATA will provide a corrective action plan if there's a dispute over jurisdictional contributions, and we would then have a way to rectify underpayment and overpayments.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Bulger. The Joint Audit Committee has been formed and is meeting and beginning to discuss the path forward for that type of thing. I would anticipate that one element of that work will be how the parties resolve different audit findings and potential increases or decreases, credits or debits in capital contributions or operating subsidy contributions in the future.
So in other words, Tom, WMATA staff will provide a corrective plan initially if there are over and underpayments.
Mr. Bulger, that process is not yet complete. I can imagine that process including the development of a corrective action plan that will require the consensus of that joint audit committee and the jurisdictions.
Okay, sorry, one last question, Mr. Chairman. So would you come back to the board on resolving a corrective action item so that we don't have to go to dispute resolution? I don't want to go to dispute resolution over a de minimis amount of over or under payments by the jurisdictions. Seems ridiculous.
Mr. Bulger, I think in a circumstance where there were de minimis differences, we would certainly, between staff and the jurisdictions, bring that to the board's attention before entering into a more formal dispute resolution process.
Good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rouse.
No questions, but I'll add my name to your comments. Being a federal employee, perpetually living in continuing resolutions, having more than 1 year is always good.
Mr. Goldman.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Letourneau.
Nothing for me. Thank you.
And Ms. Goodaby Jenkins.
No questions, but I do echo my appreciation. It's definitely been a long time coming. Thank you.
All right, so we'll close discussion on this item, and I'll ask the board corporate secretary to administer a roll call vote.
Chair McMillan,
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater,
Aye.
Mr. Smidberg,
Aye.
and Mr. Bulger.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Great. So we will move to the last item on our agenda, which is the allocation of the second round of federal aid with a terrible acronym that I'm sure you'll use, Mr. Webster. Please proceed.
Yes, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a rough acronym, CRRSA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2021. And just again, for background, the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, allocated $25 billion to transit to prepare and respond to COVID. Through that CARES program, WMATA received $877 million and provided $109 million of relief in the form of jurisdictional subsidy credits to support local transit operations. The CRRSA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Appropriations Act, allocated $14 billion to transit. WMATA, through our traditional split with the regional partners, received $714 million of CRRSA funding. And today, staff is recommending providing $89 million of subsidy credits for the jurisdictions, again, to support local transit operations. And just to be clear, what we are proposing today is that the board adopt a resolution that handles the CRRSA funding and support for local transit operations in the exact same way the board approved for CARES, in the same proportions and using the same approach. On this next slide, we detail first the amounts each agency received under the CARES program, as well as the subsidy credits for the local operators within our region. Display the amounts that would be allocated under the CRRSA funding, again, in those same proportions, and then the total for each agency. With that, we recommend approval of the resolution with the allocations, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the presentation.
Thanks. Would you please go back to, actually holding, before we start the discussion, once again, I would like to move approval of this item, and I ask for a second.
Second, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So if you go back to slide 3, Mr. Webster. Just for clarity, I think this table helps illustrate the split of money in the two actions here. So you have MTA and PRTC, which from the regional allocation of the federal money are being allocated a share that they will administer directly with FTA. And for the remaining jurisdictions who have their own local transit operations, rather than have them interact directly with FTA on this, WMATA is essentially acting as a go-between, handling the relationship with FTA, and then using the jurisdictional subsidy relief as a mechanism to direct the funds to those other local transit providers. Have I stated that correctly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, with one clarification. The WMATA will receive the full, using the CRISA as an example, the full $625 million in grant funds to be used to reimburse WMATA expenses.
Yes.
The equivalent amounts shown for each of the jurisdictions would be provided as operating subsidy credits. The jurisdictions don't receive the FTA funds directly or indirectly.
Correct. So we receive those funds. We provide jurisdictional subsidy credit. We're essentially a pass-through for that portion of the money, right?
Yes. With that clarification, they are not receiving the money. That money.
Understood. So, yes, I take your point. Thank you, Mr. Webster. And just one other point that I suspect a number of other board members would like to make in this context. There is a forthcoming discussion on allocation of the third round of federal aid, correct?
Yes.
With the same group of people. And the CARES formula and this most recent one has generally followed previously existing allocation formulas associated with capital assistance. Is that generally correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the message, I think the bulk of the board would like to send through you for this next round of discussions is just as the national formula for distribution of this aid in the second and third bills is much more focused on operating budgets, operating loss. We would hope that this region allocation of the third round would also reflect more of a focus on operational costs, operational losses, since the purpose of these funds is primarily the fact that our passenger revenues have all declined precipitously, and this is meant to backfill that primarily. So if you will take that message going forward, that is that concludes my comments and questions on this. Next, Secretary Slater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question, and probably asking the same question as you in a different way. I just want to confirm that the money distribution to the local governments, we use the FTA formula for that?
We use the region's formula for the sub-allocation of the federal funds that relies on a national transit database data. So it's very similar to the federal process, but modified for our region.
Okay. All right. Thank you. No further question.
Great. Thanks. Chair Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing to add really, other than to say I agree with you on your last comments about the distribution of the funding. If there is to be a third round here, that we get those talks underway as quickly as possible and address, some of the issues I think that are present on this particular graph or a particular slide. So thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Bulger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm always curious, if we're doing a distribution, how come the Transportation Planning Board gets anything? Because they don't operate anything. Unless it's that carpool thing they do.
Yeah, Mr. Bulger, there is a van pool commuter service that is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Board, and because of that, they do report service into the National Transit Database, and based on these formulas,
Okay.
essentially get an allocation from that.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Thanks. Mr. Rouse.
Nothing from me. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you. Just one question, Mr. Webster, just to understand these numbers here. The first tranche, the CARES Act, was a distribution of 25 billion nationally, and it yielded the 767.6 for WMATA. The second, the CRISA, was a national distribution of 14 billion, which yielded the 625 million for WMATA. The third tranche, which other parties have referred to, includes 30.5 billion nationally, which is yet to be allocated. And I guess I've heard from third parties, and maybe I've read in the paper as well, that the WMATA projected share was supposed to be about 1 billion. That's so a billion with 10 numbers, 10 digits. Do you agree, or is that what you've heard, that the ultimate number for WMATA should be about 1 billion? And if that's so, is the 1 billion the last line WMATA number, like for the CRISA, the 625, or is the 1 billion the very last line in the colored type, the 714 million?
Mr. Goldman, the rescue plan national apportionments occurred, I believe, just last week. The region in that apportionment will get 1.4 billion in total. So if you were to apply these same percentages, that would result in WMATA getting approximately 1 billion. But as has been discussed here, there's discussions that need to happen about that allocation. But the number we do know right now is 1.4 billion for the Washington urbanized area.
So going back to that slide 3, so the 1.4 is the number that would correspond to the 714 million, and the 1 billion is the number that would correspond to the 625 million for the CRISA allocations. Is that correct?
Actually, the 1.4 is the combined total of the 36 to MTA, the 81 to PRTC, and the 713 to WMATA.
Okay, so it's all right, but the 1 billion for WMATA would be equivalent to the 625 million line.
That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. And Mr. Webster, just to clarify a point raised by Mr. Goldman here, that a $25 billion national distribution in CARES resulted in the 767, and then 14 billion nationwide, getting very close to that same amount coming directly to WMATA for its needs. That is a reflection of the fact that the second round of aid, unlike the CARES Act, included a cap on total assistance equal to 75% of 2018 operating expenses for recipients. Am I stating that correctly?
That's exactly correct.
Yeah, so in effect, you had a smaller pool of dollars in the second round, but that cap in the formula wound up cutting out in raw numbers a large majority of the recipients from the first round of CARES money. Okay, next, Mr. Letourneau.
Sorry, sticky mute button. I don't really know that I have anything else other than agree that we need to have those conversations on the American Recovery Act money as well. But for today, we're fine.
Okay, and Ms. Gittemy Jenkins.
No questions. Thank you to the delegation for their support for the region.
All right, and I don't see any hands up, so we will close discussion on this item, and I'll ask the Board Corporate Secretary to administer a roll call vote.
Chair McMillan,
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater,
Aye.
Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
and Mr. Bulger.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, and with no further business to come before the committee, we stand adjourned, and I will turn the floor over to Mr. Goldman for today's Safety and Operations Committee meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. McMillan. If Chair Smedberg is all right, we'll proceed directly to the Safety and Operations Committee meeting.
Absolutely. Yep.
Very good. This will be a return appearance by Ms. Impastato. So I see she's already on screen there, but we'll start off with the preliminaries. So good morning and welcome to today's Safety and Operations Committee meeting. Thanks for joining us. We have today's agenda before us. If there are no objections, I'd like to move to approve the agenda as presented. Are there any objections? Since I can't see you on my screen, shout out if you have an objection. Hearing none, the agenda is approved. We also have the minutes from our last meeting before us for approval. I trust the committee has had an opportunity to review the minutes from our March 11th, 2021 meeting. Unless there are objections, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. Again, if you object, just shout something out since I can't see you. I hear none, so we'll consider the minutes approved. We have one informational update on today's agenda. Staff, in the person of Ms. Teresa Impastato, will be providing an update on recent initiatives designed to improve safety on Metro Bus and Metro Access, developed using a risk management approach based on safety management system principles. So I'll turn the floor now over to Ms. Impastato for a presentation on this item.
Thank you, sir. This briefing will provide our annual update on the implementation of safety improvements throughout Metro's bus and Metro Access services. This presentation begins with a benchmarking review conducted with 4 of our sister agencies, SEPTA in Philadelphia, MBTA in the Boston area, Chicago Transit Authority, and MARTA in the Atlanta area. As part of our implementation of a safety management system, we're focusing our efforts on observable trends and are seeking to identify best practices to improve safety. The 4 main metrics used to gauge bus safety performance are recorded in the National Transit Database, or NTD, as pedestrian strikes, collision rate, customer injury rate, and finally, employee injury rate. The peer comparison of data uses the most recent closed calendar year of 2019. We also have, for comparative purposes, Metro's performance comparing 2019 and 2020. The NTD pedestrian collision metric has decreased calendar year over calendar year, with 23 strikes in 2019 compared to 8 in 2020. The percentage of pedestrian strikes occurring within crosswalks decreased year over year, indicating that the majority of strikes occurred outside of traffic control devices. When compared to our peers, Metro has the 3rd highest pedestrian strike rate of 0.5 strikes per million revenue miles. The NTD bus collision rate had a 31% year-over-year decrease with a rate of 2.8 collisions per million miles. The majority of the collisions were rated as non-preventable, which includes cases where a bus was struck in the rear or a vehicle violates traffic control devices by running a stop sign or a red light and strikes the bus on the side. When compared with our peers, Metro did experience the highest collision rate with 5.5 collisions per million revenue miles. The NTD metric for injuries includes those that require immediate transport from an incident scene for medical attention. When compared to our peer agencies, WMATA has the third highest injury rate for employees. When evaluating employee injuries using OSHA recordable criteria, WMATA's employee injury rate had a 30% year-over-year decrease to result in a rate of 8.1 employee injuries per 100 employees in calendar year 2020. Injury categories that saw the largest decreases included stress and assaults, collision-related, and ergonomic injuries. Finally, Metro's customer injury rate had a 19% year-over-year decrease, with a rate of 2.2 customer injuries per million linked trips. Injuries related to both preventable and non-preventable collisions saw significant decreases in the injury rate. When comparing all sources of customer injuries with our peers, Metro is roughly in the middle, with about 2.8 customer injuries per million unlinked trips. Many of the piloted safety initiatives from the last board bus safety initiative brief have been fully implemented. All of these initiatives resulted in rate decreases during the pilot phase. By using a data-driven approach, fleet-wide implementation became justified. Since full implementation of the pedestrian strobe light initiative, there has been a 22% reduction in pedestrian crosswalk strikes. Although this decrease is at odds with the pedestrian strike increase, the decrease can be attributed to a ton of pedestrians that would use a crosswalk. The deceleration lights installed on the fleet flash when the bus is decelerating to come to a stop. The incident rate for hit and rear decreased 8% comparing FY20 and FY21 July through February. Finally, a mirror lowering and adjustment campaign was the result of a confidential close call program recommendation. Mirror-related incidents contributed to strike collisions, and the retrofit was also successful. This move was not only a benefit for decrease in mirror strikes, but also improved the operator's ability to adjust the mirror and potentially removed blind spots. Since full implementation, there's been a 13% decrease in mirror strike incidents. All of these initiatives are now deployed fleet-wide. Bus operator reported assaults decreased 9% from 92 to 84 year over year, and assault-related injuries decreased 21% from 107 to 85 year over year. At our March 11th presentation on Metro's performance for July to December 2020, board members asked how shields have impacted operator assaults. As of April 2019, 100% of the Metro fleet has been outfitted with bus shields. We've seen a decrease in operator assaults since 2018 and believe that our integrated strategy of physical barriers or shields, as well as de-escalation training, has contributed to that improvement. We continue to monitor data and statistics relative to the efficacy of our bus shields deployment. We know that most assaults start with a service dispute or other type of verbal altercation, and view de-escalation training as key in our efforts to reduce injuries to our workforce. Metro Police utilizes a targeted deployment of resources as well, such as high-intensity targeted enforcement, and participates in bus division safety meetings and continues to work with youth through our Respect Your Ride youth program. Other initiatives include providing bus operators with de-escalation tactics during training, focuses on reducing conflict and promoting conflict resolution. Metro also has a robust performance behavior analysis program to reduce risky driver behaviors, which would lead to reduced collisions, reduced injuries, and improved performance by emphasizing consistent monitoring and standardization of the usage of our DriveCam system. We've developed a coaching manual created to focus on providing best practices for effectively coaching our operators with DriveCam events, and have regularly reviewed the results of DriveCams post any incident that could involve an employee assault. Floating bus stops are being explored in collaboration with the District Department of Transportation. Data demonstrates that service stop accidents contributed to the 16% increase in preventable accidents that our bus division experienced. Floating bus stops would help prevent the blockage of bus zones, which create hazards for our bus operators, both in their approach to service stops, including pulling in and away. Metro has partnered with DDOT in installing permanent floating bus stops near the 14th Street and N Street. Some issues related to accessibility were needed to be resolved. Once those modifications are complete, the floating bus stops will be placed into use. Metro was awarded a Virginia Department of Transportation grant to test the effectiveness of a mobile eye shield and collision avoidance system on transit buses. I reported last year the results of our initial pilot. Beginning in October 2019, the system was installed in 5 buses operating out of the 4 Mile Run bus garage. The buses operated in stealth mode initially, where only traffic data was collected by the systems. It became fully active later in the year, providing notifications to bus operators when the system detects the possibility of a collision. Operators using these buses were trained on a variety of the warnings that the system will alert them to and the actions they can take to avoid impending collision. These systems include several components such as exterior side sensors and cameras that monitor both sides of the bus for pedestrians, vehicles, and objects in the path of a turn. Also, a windshield mount sensor that monitors the front path of the bus for following distance and other objects in a direction of a path of a bus, as well as an interior driver alert display that provides a visual alert when any of the sensors detect a possible collision. There are 2 main categories that these warnings fall into: a headway or forward collision warning that alerts the operator to a reduced following distance between the bus and the vehicle immediately ahead. This gives the operator the chance to slow down and increase the distance between their bus and anything ahead of it. Additionally, there are pedestrian warning and danger zone alerts that alert the operator to pedestrians in the travel path of the bus. These alerts are specific to where the pedestrian may be located in relation to the bus, front, rear, either left or right side. The alerts are different from the vehicle collision warning and will escalate based upon the imminent danger of a collision. Our data review showed a decrease in the occurrence of near misses with pedestrians and an increase in the average following distance between Metro buses and other vehicular traffic. This overall improvement in operator behavior was shown to have a 25% reduction in vehicular and pedestrian alerts. We decided to expand the pilot into a second phase across all bus divisions. In the event that we obtain similar positive results, Metro will exercise an option to install the system fleet-wide on over 1,600 buses. Next, I'd like to review the multiple actions that Metro has taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, including developing a means to monitor real-time crowding information that will show in a couple different categories, the availability of seating on a bus, as well as external communication, emphasizing the need for facial coverings, emphasizing compliance over enforcement, and ramping up additional mask distribution opportunities. All Metro buses are fitted with mask dispensers that are replenished on a daily basis. Ongoing monitoring of the stockpile of the mask dispensers is undertaken. Additionally, Metro performs daily disinfection of the fleet by a third-party contractor. Beginning at the rear of the bus, this contractor pays careful attention to seat backs, stanchions, handrails, and any touch surfaces, cleaning and disinfecting with an EPA-approved disinfectant known to kill coronavirus. Also, all buses are returned for midday cleaning. Metro is evaluating 2 UVC-type air purification systems in collaboration with an academic institution to monitor the test plan and data analysis. These efforts are underway, and we are currently noting positive performance by both systems. Lastly, Metro is following the recommendations of the original equipment manufacturer of our HVAC systems on buses. We've upgraded our fleet to MERV 7 filters and have experienced no negative impacts on the function of our HVAC system on board our buses. Higher MERV ratings can decrease airflow and increase the risk of component failure, so we're working closely with the equipment manufacturer to assure no negative results. We are anticipating imminent approval by the manufacturer of a MERV 10 filter and will be moving to install it as soon as feasible. At this time, installing higher than a MERV 10 filter in the current Metro fleet is at risk of causing significant damage to the internal components of the HVAC system. This is an industry-wide issue, and we are working very closely with vendors and manufacturers to continue to improve the filtration and sanitization of our system. Next, with regard to Metro Access performance and benchmarking, the two metrics used to gauge Metro Access safety performance are the collision rate and the customer injury rate. Similar to our bus comparison, the peer comparison data uses the most recent closed out calendar year of 2019. The overall Metro Access collision rate had a 38% year-over-year decrease, with a rate of 1.5 collisions per million miles. The majority of these collisions were considered to be the result of non-preventable action, such as when a Metro Access vehicle was struck in the rear while stopped. When compared with our peers, Metro had the lowest number of collisions per million revenue miles with a rate of 0.9. The NTD customer injury rate decreased 57% year over year with a rate of 1.0 customer injuries per 100,000 linked trips. Injuries were primarily related to slips, trips, and falls during boarding and alighting Metro Access vehicles. When comparing all sources of customer injuries to our peers, Metro did have a highest rate of customer injuries with 2.3 customer injuries per 100,000 trips in calendar year 2019. Many of our actions are being taken to address this customer injury rate. As of January 2021, Metro has added 24-hour video and audio recording with search and save capability to our existing drive cams. Our drive cam pilot, which I had discussed last year, has now been implemented fleet-wide in any Metro Access vehicles that are not slated for imminent retirement. Additionally, this will allow us to expand our root cause analysis and improve the quality of our investigations as we monitor reports of injuries, concerns, or issues. Additionally, we've enhanced communications methods with regard to our COVID-19 safety messaging and have produced detailed messaging on mask usage, as well as reaching out to the communities in which we serve. We are also piloting some additional training and safety messaging efforts. I spoke last year of a collaboration that Metro began with an occupational therapist to look to identify ways to reduce the risk of injury for our customers. We are continuing that collaboration and are working with our risk management department. We are also providing detailed customer assistance training for our sedan customers. Lastly, Metro is rolling out an additional safety communications campaign through our contractors as well as to our riders. Safety is not an accident, which will reinforce best practices for boarding and alighting with the hope of reducing incidents, injuries, and costs associated with corresponding claims. To conclude, these efforts underscore Metro's ability to systematically reduce risk by driving action before incidents occur, led by a robust data analysis. Our safety risk management process is using data and assurance methods to identify, assess, and mitigate proactively. These initiatives are examples of data-driven risk management strategies that support the safety risk management pillar of Metro's safety management system. This concludes our presentation, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. That's a very exciting presentation with some very interesting initiatives that are underway on the Metrobus and Metro Access side to improve safety. I guess I would like to start with a few questions, and I think the good place to start would be the benchmarking slide. That's slide number 3. Before asking something specific, I thought for the benefit one, number 3, keep going. Number 3, we're trying to get to.
It appears there's a delay, but I will go to the bottom.
It's a little slow today.
There we go.
There we go. I thought for the benefit of those trying to follow these charts on their screen, it might be helpful for you to start and just identify the 5 systems, the icons that are being used. So it's, I mean, the M for Metro is fairly recognizable, but if you could just indicate what are the transit properties associated with the other 4 icons, I think that would be helpful to those who are watching on screen.
Certainly. So if we look at the upper left corner, the NTD pedestrian collision rate, beginning from left, moving to the right, the S logo is SEPTA in Philadelphia. The T inside the circle logo is the MBTA in Boston. Of course, Metro is in the middle. The second from the right in that chart is CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority. And the tricolored logo furthest on the right is MARTA in metropolitan Atlanta.
Very good. So that gives us a clear picture of the players here that we're comparing ourselves to. So I have, some concerns with two of these, especially the collision rate information, as well as the employee injury rate information. So on the collision rate, which I guess the comparative one is the one on the top, second over, if you're, I guess, third over if you're going left to right, which unfortunately shows WMATA being with the sort of the leader of the pack in the sense of having the worst record here. So I wanted to first ask you what sort of initiatives are really underway to try and reduce that. And while I recognize that in the immediate right chart, you're showing, a reduction from calendar year 19 into calendar year 20, I think we need to have a little asterisk with that kind of a chart, since 20 includes those, I guess, first 4 or 5 months of the pandemic, March through June 2020, when we were operating a reduced level of operations, and there was less traffic out on the streets that would result in a collision with the Metrobus. And I would ask you to comment on that as well. But if you could sort of, let's comment on what are the principal safety initiatives being taken to try and reduce that, and whether you agree with me that perhaps we need to wait for a full year post-COVID before assessing whether these initiatives are showing progress and being effective.
Sure. So with regard to our collision rate, every time a collision occurs, there's a robust investigation to determine causal and contributory factors. As a result of our investigations, the majority of the collisions that Metro is experiencing are rated as non-preventable, which essentially means that there were no actions that the bus driver should have taken or could have taken to reasonably prevent the incident. Non-preventable incidents are usually being struck in the rear or a side impact when somebody violates a stop sign or a red light. Some of the actions that Metro has put in place to work to reduce the likelihood of these non-preventable accidents are the lights that I discussed. I advanced the slide to illustrate it. The flashing lights for deceleration, as well as those continuous flashing on the top of the bus lights to increase the visibility of our buses. With regard to preventable accidents that Metro experiences, we are doing those dash cam reviews, working with operators on an individualized basis to identify causal factors, whether there were issues with fatigue or distraction or visibility, to work with them to identify ways in which they could have prevented those incidents. The majority of our efforts are focused on working on the human factors for the preventable incidents, but also working to identify with third-party partners whether or not there are things that we can do to reduce the likelihood of these non-preventable incidents. We can do traffic analyses, looking at whether or not there are common intersections in which we're having these types of non-preventable incidents. And we can work with the relevant jurisdictional authorities to identify modifications to those areas that we identify trends in. Things that we've considered in the past are changing some of the light timing for folks that will be making turns, giving traffic preemption options, as well as increasing, of course, some enforcement for areas where we see driver noncompliance with traffic laws. With regard to the collision rate year over year, 2019 to 2020, recognizing that 2020 was truly a year unlike any other, we wanted to make sure that we could have a reasonable comparison year over year. So we did normalize the collisions by virtue of per million miles operated to allow us to compare one year versus another. Operating so many fewer million miles, one would expect, if you had had the same number of incidents, a massive increase in the rate. But since we've operated both fewer miles as well as had fewer collisions, we're confident in asserting that there was a reduction. However, we need to do some additional data analysis and some additional data acquisition over the coming months to see whether or not those reductions were anomalous or are able to be sustained.
All right, thank you. And then turning to the employee injury rate, in the middle, on the left-hand side, seems to show that WMATA is sort of in the middle of the pack. But then you have in the middle here this comparison where WMATA's injury rate is almost twice this, I guess, Bureau of Labor Statistics broader workforce rate that's on the right side. So we sort of have two different sets of data, and appreciate if you could just integrate them and indicate, whether you think the middle rate is sort of non-representative for transit property and WMATA in particular, and whether you think we're really making progress in reducing the employee injury rates.
Sure. So there are two different formulas that are used. Unfortunately, there are some constraints with the availability of data in the National Transit Database. By virtue of those constraints, we were unable to utilize the OSHA recordable formula, EIR, which normalizes the number of incidents that you have by an average rate of 100 employees over the course of a calendar year. So the middle chart shows Metro's employee injury rate in accordance with the industry standard OSHA EIR rate. That is 11.5. When compared with the overall Bureau of Labor Statistics rate for all industries, not just including Metro, so it could be administrative industries, as well as other service professions, the average across all facets of industry is 6.5, which shows that Metro is slightly higher. What we felt would be of value would be a comparison between Metro and other transportation service providers to try and slice and segment that portion of the industry to see if Metro was an outlier. The constraint that I spoke of before, within NTD, we don't have employee hour data readily available. So the only thing that we could use as a metric to normalize between our sister agencies and ours, given some of the differences in our service levels, was to normalize per million unlinked trips. So this gives us the ability to compare like sets of data. When we put Metro against our sister agencies, what we see is we're roughly in the middle of the pack. We see that Metro's employee injury rate per million unlinked trips is approximately 0.6, which comports with generalized injury rates using that metric across the industry. Any injury is too many, and Metro is committed to reducing our employee injury rate. Many of the programs that we're rolling out are having positive influence in reducing risk and likelihood of injury and reducing serious injury to our workforce. So we are going to continue to relentlessly drive to get that number as low as reasonably practical.
So would a fair summary of the three charts dealing with employee injuries be that bus driving is inherently a more injury-prone occupation than many in the country, but that compared with other transit properties, WMATA is sort of in the middle of the pack average, and that based on what's shown on the right-hand side, that we seem to be making progress in reducing the employee injury rate here at WMATA.
Absolutely, sir.
Thank you. Let me now turn to slide 9, which deals with the MERV filters. Now, just to, it is slow today. Yeah. Just to repeat what you're saying, right now we're using these MERV 7 filters, but that we are transitioning to using MERV 10 filters on our buses once we get a sign off from the manufacturer of the heating air conditioning system that's installed on the buses.
That's correct.
And would that be on all buses that would
Yes.
be going to 7, from 7 to MERV 10?
Yes, sir. That would be throughout the fleet.
And is there a higher standard even than MERV 10, which is available for buses that we may have on order or are subject to procurement, new buses that we are looking to bring into the fleet over the next couple of years?
So it is possible to utilize higher filtration with newer HVAC systems. It is possible in our procurement effort that we can, through our specification, receive higher filtration, having systems come onto the property that are properly attuned to handle a MERV rating greater than 10.
But I think what I'm hearing you say is that we're not actively seeking a MERV rating higher than 10 in any of our new bus procurements.
Not exactly. So we are requesting that the manufacturers examine their specifications for the systems that they have to seek those improvements. I can get back to you with what's commercially available, but I don't believe that we've found any currently in service commercially available systems that have higher than the MERV 10 that are compatible with WMATA's service patterns. I will confirm that, but I don't think that we've found that currently out on the market. We did some benchmarking activities with our sister agencies and did find that we're all roughly in the same place with regard to utilizing the MERV 7, actively anticipating upgrades to MERV 10, especially within the DMV.
All right, and while I know this is beyond the scope of your presentation, but for our rail riders, what's the MERV level in the rail cars, the 7 series, and that are currently the major part of the fleet, and if you know what's in the procurement for the Hitachi 8000 series rail cars?
So we have recently completed upgrades to the filtration systems throughout the Metro fleet in 2Ks, 3Ks, the currently out of service 6Ks, as well as the 7Ks. All of those train sets have different HVAC systems. They are currently rated at, I believe, a MERV 13. I will confirm it, and we're working to get MERV 15 throughout them with the OEM HVAC manufacturers. Throughout Metro facilities, in our stations, we do have MERV 15 filtration systems as well. And
Excellent.
Mr. Leader, if there's anything that you wanted to add to this with some specific.
I was just going to add that, as each procurement that goes out, whether it's for the rail side or the bus side, we will look for the best technology that's out there and put it in. Also, as we begin these tests that we've been doing with different filters, that will go into the specification of the contract. That's all I was going to add.
Thank you very much. Now, I just wanted to assure our rail riders that they were getting a MERV rating certainly as good and as you've described it, much higher in the stations and in the rail cars that we can provide. Thank you. All right, we'll look to other questions from members of the committee and members of the board. Mr. Rouse, you would be next.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Teresa, for a great presentation. I'm certainly interested to see how some of these pilot projects affect the statistics, particularly where we have higher rates like pedestrian. incidents. So it'll be interesting to see how like the collision avoidance system that you're looking at in particular, how that fares. It's always good to try to find your high points and do whatever you can to try to knock those statistics down. And it's always it never ends, right? As you know, you keep working on it, and that's the goal. Safety is keep driving towards zero in every category. But in that area in particular, like for systems like the collision avoidance, in order to truly get a real evaluation of capability of that system, it's just as important to have adequate training on using the system. I'm guessing it doesn't, and I think you've mentioned this before, but it doesn't automatically operate the brakes. So it's not like some of the systems you have on a modern vehicle that you might buy, right? So it's still dependent on the driver responding in a timely manner once they see that warning. But it can be very difficult to utilize those systems if you don't have a chance to exercise that response, right? So is there any corresponding training program for this that would give the drivers a real world, in a safe environment, ability to see how the system's working and respond, so that they can kind of get some muscle memory developed that, okay, when I see that come up, this is what I need to start prepare myself to do? Because if that doesn't occur, then the system may not actually have the benefits that it's intended to have. Just curious what the plan is in that area.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a passive system. It's not active. It will not in any way, shape, or form override the acceleration or braking systems. It will increase in urgency, similar to some of the alarming features of a standard automobile nowadays. As you approach and the distance between your vehicle and a fixed object decreases, it'll increase the rate of the alert. We are training our folks, a combination of classroom and practical training, how to use the system. We give them a little bit of some theory, explain to them how the system works, where it's mounted, what the warnings look and sound like before we get them into our buses. And then we do have them utilize the system. We do set up and simulate some near collision occurrences, of course, in a safe environment for them to learn and experience firsthand what it's like. We also have been reviewing our drive cam usage to see, in the event that we have the system installed, but it's not successful, or we have the system installed and there's a challenge with it. We've been using the drive cam review process in our mentoring sessions with our bus operators to confirm their attentiveness and appropriate response in the event that they receive these alarms.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that continues to be an area, whether it's bus operators or rail, where it's growing in importance, because we keep throwing technology at these operators to solve problems, but in many ways we're also causing more problems because now there's more distractions and more things for these operators to have to deal with. And without having a chance to exercise how those systems should be used and what they're doing and what their response is, it can be, sometimes it can have the opposite effect, right, by just being a distraction. So that training element, as we've talked about in other areas, is becoming more and more important, and it's critical to making these programs successful. Right? The other thing, I love the floating bus boarding area idea, and I hope to see that some more, and hopefully that continues to be a success and maybe helps us drive better designs, in urban areas especially, and how we design streets and incorporate buses. It's always been a challenge. It's always, there's trade-offs everywhere you go, and certainly trying to balance traffic capacity, parking, and buses, and turning capability with the street system and capacity at intersections. There's 1,000 different ways you can go, and so anytime you find a solution that seems to be moving in the right direction, or at least improving safety and not having a large impact on the capacity of the street system, it's a good thing to see, and so I'm hoping to see more in that area. I did note one of your efforts was related to the bus mirror in particular was related to a close call, confidential close call system. Is that program still in existence for the bus side of the house?
It is. So Metro still has an active confidential close call reporting program. We have had this program for a number of years, And this is actually one of the exemplar reports that we've used to illustrate to folks the value of close call reporting by informing us of some concerns and issues with the resulting blind spot and difficulty of high mounted mirrors. We were able to engineer a retrofit that reduced the likelihood of near miss incidents. So this really was a really great outcome of our voluntary safety reporting efforts.
Is there an equivalent one for the rail side?
There is. Metro's confidential close call program is not mode specific. It's throughout Metro's operations. And as part of our SMS implementation, we're working to expand and further enhance our voluntary safety reporting programs. So we've just completed some internal reviews to identify some additional opportunities for expansion and increased participation throughout the workforce.
And I probably should know this, right? So my apologies, but I always get confused with some of our properties and the programs that we have. But is that program for both sides of the house in any way tied to the industry at large as well? Is there any sharing of I know obviously the confidential element has to be scrubbed, and so the data has to be very well controlled, but are there any efforts are there any transit, from the transit side of the house, are there any programs that kind of link the data so that a useful outcome or a useful element like this, where something is identified as a potential hazard and a fix is determined that might remedy that, is that shared throughout other properties? Is there a program for that or a means to do that, or is that something we should explore with APTA?
So unfortunately, right now, Metro is the only known transit operator that has a confidential close call reporting program. So the industry at large is really missing out on that information sharing benefit that's available for a lot of the commuter rail properties. One of the opportunities that we did identify in our internal review was to continue information sharing. And Metro is actively exploring options to engage with sister agencies and to encourage and support establishing these types of programs throughout our operations so that we can benefit from one another's experiences. With this specific issue that we identified, we did reach out to some of our sister agencies and shared our results with them in the spirit of free communication. But right now, there's not a formal mechanism for us to do that. However, we hope to, over the next 12 to 24 months, establish that type of a mechanism and step into a leadership capacity in encouraging other transit systems to utilize voluntary safety reporting programs.
Yeah, I think that's important, right? We talk about SMS, we talk about SSPP, all these different programs for enhancing safety, but if you look at aviation in particular, they have a very robust confidential reporting system to address hazards and risks that we don't see, right? That's if you really want to get down to the next level of safety, you have to start identifying those and coming up with mitigations to address them, because otherwise you're just passively addressing accidents that occur, right? And that's, you'll always have more accidents occur, and you'll always continue to try to put band-aids on the problem, but you'll never actively get to a point where you can address potential hazards in real time or close to real time before they become an accident. And so having programs like this and having the benefit of a large data set to pull from, not just Washington area Metro bus and Metro rail, but having industry-wide efforts where we can share this type of information, share best practices and what we've learned and what works, is really critical to having some of those safety management systems give them another tool to be successful in the long run, rather than just being a plan on a shelf somewhere, right? So certainly, to whatever degree I can help there and working with industry, that's something I'd be interested in doing and helping get others on board. Obviously we have it's been a struggle on the commuter rail side to get a program up, and it's not easy. But the long-term benefits have been proven time and time again. So certainly anything we can do to to expand this and get more data, not only for ourselves, but for the industry as a whole is a good thing. So thank you, Teresa. That's all I've got, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. Your insights on these safety issues are always valuable to WMATA, and I'm sure to the staff as well. Ms. Gidby Jenkins.
Thank you. Can we go to slide 9? I think my comments are actually just going to be around, and this might be Lynn, how we're amplifying the overall COVID process to the public. I think you have been a great face for safety, but also for our COVID response. I think a lot of the images that we see on TV reflect Metro Rail, but not necessarily maybe Metro Bus. And with the upgrades of the filter pieces, I'd love to learn a little bit more on how we're amplifying what we are doing on Metro Bus. Ultimately, it's the perception of folks feeling safe to return back. And so to the extent that we can have some ads that really feature what we're doing on Metro Buses, especially as it relates to the filtration components, I think that would be a really powerful image. So I'm not sure if that's in the scope of the next coming ads or if we're going to have new ads, but I just wanted to get a better understanding as to how we might be encouraging folks to come back, given the safety responses and cleanliness that we're offering for riders.
Right. So actually, thanks for the question. We did have advertisements that were both rail and bus in the last wave, but we are preparing for the next round of Doing Our Part. And the Doing Our Part ads will be bus focused as well as rail, and will really focus on the continued cleaning conventions, including air filtration, as well as the ability to social distance when you're on the system. And that's really what we're finding in our research that customers are concerned about. And so that's the next wave. And actually, we expect to begin that in the next month. And so we're going to be, again, really focused on getting that message out to people. The media buys, and I'd be happy to give the board more information on this as time goes on, but our awareness levels are showing that our media buy plan is penetrating lots of different demographic targets, and that we've been able to, through the digital space in particular, but also through sports programming and lifestyle programming, reach both bus and rail audiences with the message. And what we're seeing come back is a very high percentage of both bus and rail customers saying Metro's doing all the right things. The number one concern that comes back from bus customers in particular is a concern about other passengers not adhering or complying with CDC requirements such as mask wearing. But by and large, people do see other passengers complying with the CDC guidelines. So they are feeling like the steps that we're taking are substantial, and absent the vaccine, which is the number one thing they all want to feel safer when riding, that the mask wearing is key.
Okay, that's helpful for me. The other piece, and I didn't get a chance to ask it during the budget conversation, so this might be a question for the GM, but one of the elements also is that essentially, I think, leading on to how Steve talked about the supply and demand piece, we're leading with supply strongly on Metro Rail. I mean, at this point, it's like 2 or 3 times the number. But for Metro Bus, because of how we may have to do social distancing up to 20 people, what is our plan for as things truly ramp up? Because we're kind of already where the public is for Metro Bus, but maybe not necessarily for the full amount for the spatial requirements. Essentially, we're half the buses allowed to be used during this time. So what is our contingency plan for being able to plan for folks returning, particularly on Metro Bus, that offers this spacing? Is it going to be more frequency to address the crowding issues that may come as part of it? Compared to how we're planning for Metro Rail?
Hi, this is Paul Wiedefeldt, General Manager. Yes, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to maintain the flexibility both with the staff and the equipment to do that, to monitor that. But I think there are a lot of things are going to be changing, in the next few months, and maybe this distance things may start to change. We've seen some talk of that at schools, for instance. So if that starts to change, then that changes the whole dynamic as well. So like everything else we've been dealing with, we sort of have to be very flexible and aggressive when we can be. And obviously, it'll be really dependent upon Teresa providing a lot of the safety guidance on how we do that.
And are we currently right now in terms of our fleet versus how much we actually have out on the road? Can you give kind of a comparison? Do we have essentially enough fleets to be able to kind of meet the 6 or social distancing pieces? Or another way to put the question is, we don't put the majority of our buses out on the road on any given day. Can you give me like the percentage of buses that we put out and compared to the fleet that we have and the availability?
Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. Maybe Joe has it off the top of his head. Joe, do you have that when you're?
Yeah, this is Joe Leader, Operating Officer, sorry. Yes, we're putting out roughly about 900 buses, and we have about 1,500 buses in our fleet. Of course, we don't run, when we were running pre-pandemic, we didn't run all 1,500 because we have some that are in for PMIs, road, work orders, as well as overhauls. So we probably ran pre-pandemic about 1,250 to about 300 buses.
Okay, so in terms of our capacity, we have available buses if necessary. If things increase in a great way and folks are returning back fully and we still need to social distance, we do have a good amount of fleet availability to also support the redundancy of ensuring that we have more frequency for social distancing.
Correct. And the other thing I'd just like to mention is, we've also, about 2 months ago, started putting masks on our bus. So we are supplying surgical masks individually wrapped for our bus commuters, and they're going to about 3,000 to 4,000 a day are being taken. So we're also trying to help the customers that aren't using our buses to make sure that they're masked.
Yeah, and I took the W2 not too long ago, and folks were masked up and it felt fine. So just encouraged. I definitely was excited about the filtration to the extent that we can promote that digitally and let folks know that we are doing everything that we can. I think you can't do the same level of spacing on Metro bus as you can for Metro Rail, but to see the pieces that we're doing, even with the air purification, to the extent that we can continue to promote those pieces. Already been a great job, but I think we need to continue to do more. I think that would be great. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. The next member of the committee is Mr. Letourneau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honestly, I think all of you have asked such detailed questions, and we spent a long time on this, so I really can't add anything else. Thank you for the update.
Very good. All right, we'll move on to other non-members of the committee. Secretary Slater.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Just not a lot of question here, just more want to associate myself with Ms. Giddeby's line of questioning on promoting what we're doing from the COVID side, because I think it's a big part of how we build that rider confidence back so they can feel comfortable and bring that ridership back. But other than that, I just want to thank Ms. Impastato for her great work.
Very good. Mr. McMillan.
Nothing further to add. Appreciate all the work that's been done and the thoughtful questions that preceded me. Thank you.
Mr. Bulger. Mr. Bulger, are you muted? All right, we'll skip Mr. Bulger and go on to Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything to add.
Oh, okay, thank you, Mr. Bulger.
I don't have anything to add.
Thank you. Mr. Smedberg.
Yeah, just say thank you to Ms. Impastato and her team, and appreciate the detailed presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. I just want to finish up with a question on Metro Access on slide 12 for you. I think this is the first time we've had a public presentation which has dealt with the sedans that are part of the Metro Access fleet. Could you just talk a little bit about that program? I know it's not in your bailiwick of knowledge, but how many sedans do we now have out there as opposed to vans, and whether the drivers are interchangeable between the sedan and the van fleets? And finally, just how does one qualify? How does one become eligible to ride in a sedan if a rider prefers the sedan service rather than the traditional van service?
Sure. So currently within the Metro Access fleet, we have 721 vans and 65 sedans. So the vast majority of the fleet is van-based. Sedans are primarily assigned to short trips, less than 12 miles in a one-way distance, trips that originate from densely populated areas, and trips in which the rider does not have a mobility device that may require the use of a van. Our customers can request a vehicle preference, and Metro Access will make every effort to accommodate that. With regard to our drivers, the Metro Access drivers are trained and certified to operate both the vans and the sedans.
So for our Access riders, if you're ambulatory and you prefer or think it's desirable to have the sedan, you just request it when you're making your request for Metro Access transportation. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct, sir. Subject to availability, we are increasing the number of sedans that we have in our fleet. And the Metro Access team, as well as the safety team, have been working with the AAC to identify opportunities to increase the usage of the sedans and to ensure that we're providing the best, safest service possible.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. Appreciate the presentation for the committee again and for myself personally. So with no further business to come before the Safety and Operations Committee, we stand adjourned for today. I'll recognize Mr. Smedberg, who I assume has a request for the board to convene an executive session.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. In accordance with the bylaws, I, Paul Smedberg, request that the Board of Directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect legal positions, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions and/or the federal government, and C, personnel or labor issues, including discussion of labor contracts and labor negotiations, consideration or interviews of candidates for employment in the assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, or resignation of individuals, and G, disposition of WMATA property or acquisition of real property for WMATA purposes where discussion in public would adversely affect the financial interest of WMATA. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Goldman. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. We'll see you in the breakout room in a few minutes. Or
Mr. Chairman, can we just take a couple minute break?
yeah, we'll go ahead and